When you think of a cleric, whether we're talking Dungeons & Dragons or other RPGs, the first thing most of us think about is the healer, the support character with a staff or maybe a mace that protects their allies, returns life to the fallen, and is otherwise the goodest of guys acting on behalf of their deity or some higher power to be a hero. Anyone who's played D&D with a war cleric knows that this is not always the case, but even if we acknowledge that there are most definitely clerics who don't fit the stereotype, the idea of the cleric as a well-meaning healer is pervasive in the genre. But today, we're gonna break that down and talk about what a cleric in D&D actually is, and explore what happens when someone sworn to a deity takes the path to lichdom and becomes the most dangerous form of undead to ever exist. That's right, folks, being a lich isn't just for wizards anymore, and it turns out it hasn't been that way for a very long time. In 1995, an adventure called The Ruins of Zenthill Keep was released for Advanced Dungeons & Dragons 2nd edition, and in that adventure, one of the most interesting monsters in the history of D&D was printed, the Bane Lich, a monster I feel is best described by the original lore entry penned over 30 years ago. When Bane, the god of strife, was first establishing his church long ago, those who worshipped him were hounded to their deaths by the forces of good. Tired of his faithful becoming victims, every 50 to 60 years, Bane chose the most powerful priest within the ranks of his clerics and revealed to them a foul rite that would transform the caster through force of faith, strength of will, and Bane's divine hand into a powerful, immortal form, a Lich of Bane, or Bane Lich. Bane is a god you do not want to with, even if his latest depiction from Magic the Gathering makes him look like a K-pop idol. Nowadays, especially since the release of the most recent Baldur's Gate, people know him as one of the Dead Three, a trio of deities who picked up the mantle of the god Jurgle upon his retirement from the Being a God game. Jurgle might be the single most important deity in the Forgotten Realms, but that's a topic that goes well beyond the scope of this video. The important thing about all of this is that Bane, who technically isn't even a god of death, was able to bestow a cursed unlife and lichdom to his followers through force of faith, strength of will, and his divine hand. Typically, in order to become a lich, you need to be an impossibly accomplished practitioner of the arcane arts. Countless wizards dedicate their natural-born lives to the pursuit of unlocking the secrets of lichdom. Most of them fail to find what they're looking for before time runs out, and of those who do discover how to achieve lichdom, most of them suffer an agonizing death, damning their souls in the process for even attempting to perform such a vile and taboo act. But for those who successfully complete the transition from mortal to lich, they find themselves left with all the time in the world to master the arcane. But for a Bane Lich, the thing that fuels their ascension into undeath isn't relentless pursuit of forbidden knowledge, but unwavering faith and devotion to their god. According to the original entry for the Bane Lich, in order to ascend from mere mortal to lichdom, you need to be a cleric of at least 17th level, and of course, you need to be chosen by Bane as a worthy candidate. And this brings up an extremely important question that we need to answer before we go any further. What is a cleric? I know that might seem like kind of a silly question, but it's not as clear-cut as you might think. For the sake of contrast, let's look at the wizard. A wizard is someone who personifies the maxim, knowledge is power. They cast their spells by studying them ahead of time, learning how they work, and bending forces of arcane might to their will with knowledge and understanding. Clerics, on the other hand, are granted their power by the deity they serve. They don't have to study. Instead, they simply pray to their god every day and channel the power given to them by said god. And that begs the question, why does a cleric in Dungeons & Dragons need to level up at all? If a cleric devoted to a god was trying to do something that their god wanted them to do, why wouldn't that god simply say, okay, yeah man, you're clearly trying to uphold my will, so here is the maximum amount of power I can give you, effectively making you a 20th level cleric. Some people might say that the reason that's not true is because, at the end of the day, D&D is a game, and it wouldn't really be balanced if clerics could just cast 9th level spells as soon as their god felt they were trustworthy. And while that's certainly part of it, the class fantasy tied to the act of your character leveling up in Dungeons & Dragons is extremely important, and is self-evident for virtually every other character class. The fighter gains battle experience and gets better at fighting. The bard learns new songs and gets better at weaving magic into their performance. The wizard acquires more knowledge to expand their spell book, and the cleric, well, what exactly does the Cleric do? I've heard some people suggest that the Cleric is simply proving themselves worthy of more power by continuing to act on behalf of their deity, so therefore, as more trust is established, their god gives them a bit more juice. And I do think that is part of the equation, but it doesn't account for the fact that some gods in the many pantheons of D&D are extremely trusting or reckless and wouldn't take issue with just dumping 20 levels of Cleric on someone who seems even remotely loyal to them. I've also heard it suggested that even though they're not typically thought of as an intelligence class, a Cleric is still studying the rites and prayers of their god and learning to cast spells, sort of like a wizard does, which may also be part of the equation, but I still think there's a piece missing here. It seems to me that when a Cleric levels up, they're not just building trust and learning incantations, they're also becoming more attuned with the higher power they serve. The longer a Cleric serves their god, and the more of themselves they put into that service, the more of their will is used to pursue that service, the stronger the bond between the Cleric and their god becomes. And the stronger that bond, the more power it can channel from a god through their instrument. It should come as no surprise that the word cleric has its origins in the Bible, specifically the Greek translation of the Old Testament in a passage talking about members of the church. Therefore shall they have no inheritance among their brethren, the Lord is their inheritance. In Greek, the word kleros is used to mean inheritance, which is where the word cleric comes from, literally meaning someone who has been granted God's inheritance. Without the power given to them by their god, they're just another person, and that is what defines every aspect of their being as a cleric. So when a cleric manages to ascend to the heights of power afforded to a lich through sheer force of will and devotion to their god, the end result is something entirely more horrific. This is not someone so terrified of their own mortality that they devoted their life to escaping death at any cost. This isn't a creature obsessed with personal power above all else who was willing to discard their humanity in some vain attempt to master forces they couldn't hope to possibly control. This is someone so utterly devoted to the cause of their god that they would give everything they have ever been or would be to see themselves become a tool for that deity to exert their will in the world of mortals. It is at that time, in that place of blind faith and all-consuming worship, that the Bane Lich is allowed to be born. And despite being one of the most obscure creatures of this power level in D&D's history, they are actually pretty well documented. Beyond the initial adventure they first appeared in, the Bane Lich would show up again in the annual Monster Compendium for 1995, which gave us a few ability tweaks and some killer new artwork. I really like the way they look here. They would also show up in a handful of adventures over the years, and even managed to make their way into some lore books as powerful Bane Liches became NPCs in the Forgotten Realms up until 4th edition. The most recent mention of the Bane Lich I could find was in 2006's Dragons of Faerun, where a Bane Lich named Alexshan Nether, a 30th level cleric of Bane, is mentioned briefly as a prominent member of the Cult of the Dragon, also known as the people who worship Tiamat. The Bane Lich never got its own stat block outside of 2nd edition D&D though, which is a travesty because I think this is such a cool concept for a monster. Looking at a creature as prolific and profoundly tied to the hobby as a lich through an entirely different lens is a really cool exercise if nothing else. So, what makes a Bane Lich different from a regular lich? Well, aside from the method of their creation, there aren't a ton of differences aside from the fact that Bane Liches can cast a bunch of spells from the Cleric spell list, and they lose access to spells from the Wizard spell list. There are a couple little ribbon abilities, but that's mostly it, which if I'm being honest was really disappointing. The concept of someone achieving lichdom through an alternate divine path is so cool, and it felt like such a wasted opportunity to not do something more with the idea. So, I started brainstorming. Linked in the description down below, as always, is my 5th edition conversion of our monster this week, though today's 5e stat block is less of an old monster conversion and more of an unholy glow up. I kept the bones of the monster relatively the same. After all, we still want this to feel like a lich, just a different flavor of lich. Liches are known for casting spells, and we know our Bane Lich was at least a 17th level cleric, so the entirety of the Bane Lich's spells are cleric spells, with the one exception being Power Word Kill. I chose to keep Power Word Kill on their spell list because the 2nd edition Bane Lich stat block has an ability that is basically just Power Word Kill and it's an iconic spell. Since our Lich was a cleric and not a wizard, I gave it a sacred mace attack as a primary weapon option, and drawing again from the 2nd edition Bane Lich, its primary ranged attack is a cold fire missile that deals cold damage. I also took a bit of inspiration from Toll the Dead on this one of the most popular cleric damage dealing cantrips, and added on a line of text to our cold fire missile that increases its damage dice category if the target is bloodied, meaning instead of doing d8s, it does d12s. Once I had all the basics locked in, I then started looking at the cleric player class and the death-themed subclasses such as Death Cleric and Grave Cleric for inspiration. This is where we get traits like Lord of Rot, which allows the Bane Lich's spells to bypass necrotic resistance. It's also the inspiration for legendary actions like Path to the Grave, a curse that makes the target vulnerable to all damage for a brief time. Turn the Living is a fun ability that functions very similarly to the cleric's ability to turn undead, except it only affects living creatures, and Divine Protection is a reaction I gave them to replace the standard Lich's ability to cast Shield and Counter spell every turn. Neither of those spells are on the cleric spell list, so instead I gave it a reaction that functions sort of like the spell Sanctuary. But the most exciting thing on the Bane Lich's stat block, at least in my opinion, is that they can cast Wish. Sort of. At 10th level, clerics get a neat little ability called Divine Intervention. In the original 5th edition rules, this allows you to ask your god for a favor, and there's a chance they'll throw you a bone and actually do it. In the updated 5e rules, this now allows you to just cast any cleric spell of 5th level or lower for free 1 time per long rest without spending any material components. It's a great tool for pulling out that one spell you wish you'd prepped but didn't, or casting a cheeky resurrection spell without having to pay the exorbitant cost. However, at 20th level, the cleric capstone, Greater Divine Intervention, allows you to just straight up cast Wish. If you use this feature to cast Wish instead of a lower level cleric spell, the cooldown goes from 1 day to 2d4 days, but that's still pretty damn good. Rules as written, Wish just allows you to cast any 8th level or lower spell for free, or you can try to do some insane bullshit with it, which has a chance to do a bunch of damage to you and prevent you from ever casting the spell again. It's really wordy, and it's kind of fun. But seeing as this is our cleric capstone, I, of course, gave the Bane Lich a once per week ability to cast Wish, allowing them to call on their god for aid. I mean, this guy is supposed to be like the pope of their respective god's church, right? So giving them one last trump card when they call upon their god to intervene directly with a given situation is just, well, it's downright beautiful. Speaking of their god, it's largely been assumed up until now that the god of a Bane Lich is Bane. I mean, it's in the name and everything. But in order to finish the rest of this creature's stat block, I had to make a decision about this. We could either maintain that a Bane Lich is a cleric devoted to Bane, or we could make up a bunch of new lore and broaden the scope a little bit. And I won't lie, I did not hum and or haw about this for more than 5 seconds. In fact, I pretty much started writing new Bane Lich lore immediately. Personally, I like the idea that any deity is capable of creating a Lich with their divine powers. Most of them just choose not to, because at the end of the day, the cycle of life and death is important to the multiverse, and most gods are not willing to violate its sanctity. That said, there are tons of evil or even neutral gods who don't care about that, and there might even be a few good aligned gods who would be willing to bend the rules a bit if they felt like the ends justified the means. But the point is that this is something I don't want to be exclusive to the god Bane. However, I like the name Bane Lich, and I also like the idea that maybe Bane was the first to actually do this, so while other Liches may be created by other gods, they're all still referred to as Bane Liches since he was the first one to make it happen. I also feel like the term Bane Lich just works in general, even if you're not playing a game in the Forgotten Realms and the name Bane isn't meant to evoke the specific god. If you don't like that, you could always just call them a Hallowed Lich or Divine Lich, or come up with a new cool sounding name altogether. But I'll leave that to your discretion. The next thing we need to address is the Lich's phylactery, or soul jar, I guess is what they're calling it now for some reason, but whatever you want to call it, this is a really important part of the Lich's mythology. Typically, a Lich severs their soul from their body and stores it in a magical object called a phylactery. This is what allows them to persist as an undead creature, and this also is what allows them to be continuously reborn if they're ever destroyed. In order to truly destroy a Lich, you must destroy its phylactery, otherwise it will just continue to regenerate time and time again. While you could simply have the Bane Lich work the same way, that's kind of boring, and we have a great opportunity to devise something thematic here. So rather than a phylactery, our Bane Lich has a reliquary, or should I say reliquaries. The forbidden rite that allows one to become a Bane Lich requires absolute devotion, not just from the one ascending, but from those they inspire. In order for a Bane Lich to be a successful mouthpiece and agent working on behalf of their god, they must prove that they can foster unbridled devotion in their congregation. So part of the Ascension ritual involves a willing sacrifice made in the name of the Cleric's god. No less than 12 devotees of that same god must be ritually sacrificed. Each sacrificed individual then becomes a saint of their god, and the souls of these sacrificial saints are eternally bonded to the Bane Lich. These souls retain their conscious mind, and they persist alongside the Bane Lich, providing counsel and protection to the newly born undead overlord. Then, the Bane Lich must take a body part from each of the sacrificial saints and store it within a sacred relic of their faith. This might be as simple as taking a finger from each body and wrapping it in a cloth blessed by their god, or it could be as complex as preserving and mummifying the entire body of each saint and interring it within a blessed golden sarcophagus. It's also possible that instead of creating a reliquary for each of the sacrificial saints, the Bane Lich creates one large reliquary that stores a body part from all of the sacrifices in one place. This could be a massive golden chest inlaid with esoteric runes and blessings from their deity, which holds the bones of every sacrifice, or it could be a small chapel or shrine. Whatever the case, when the ritual is complete, each of these newly created reliquaries now hold a part of one of these sacrificial saints and act as an anchor for the soul of the Bane Lich. If the Bane Lich is ever destroyed, its body will simply reform within its lair so long as at least one of these reliquaries is still intact somewhere. This is not only an extremely thematic alternative to a Lich's phylactery, but it also provides us with a ton of in-game tools to make the Bane Lich feel truly unique. First off, in my conversion, I included a pair of D10 tables to provide you with a bunch of options for what the Lich's reliquaries might actually be. Perhaps one of them is a tongue pierced by a nail and stored within a gilded container inscribed by holy text. Or maybe it's a blackened tooth held inside a puzzle box that casts power word kill on whoever opens it. Or maybe it's a still beating heart stored within a small temple carved out of black marble, and anyone who touches this small temple shrinks down to scale until they either speak a hidden command word or the reliquary within the temple is destroyed. The most important and often most exciting part of squaring off against a Lich of any kind is finding and destroying its phylactery, and in the case of the Bane Lich, finding and destroying its reliquaries could be the premise of an entire campaign, and each one should prove to be a unique challenge. I also really like the idea of a more brazen Bane Lich who creates a bunch of cursed magic weapons that all act as reliquaries. Perhaps one of the Bane Lich's reliquaries is actually a greatsword fashioned from the bones of a saint fused together and sharpened to a deadly edge, and that sword is wielded by a Death Knight champion of the Bane Lich's god, who you must find and destroy to have a chance at taking out the reliquary itself. I made sure to include rules for this in my conversion document, so if that sounds cool to you, there are procedures in place to create Bane Lich reliquary weapons as well. Secondly, the idea that the souls of those sacrificed are now tied to the Bane Lich inspired a trait on its stat block that I called the Aura of Saints. This trait is basically just a permanent casting of the spell Spirit Guardians at 5th level, which not only makes the Bane Lich a way bigger threat in melee combat, but is also cool as hell. Traditionally, a Lich hates to be locked in melee combat with a band of heroes, but this isn't a Lich. It's a Bane Lich, and usually the place your Cleric wants to be is front and center, so this will help the Bane Lich do that. Plus the idea that its aura of spiritual protectors are the souls of those sacrificed in the Lich's Ascension ritual is metal as hell. The third thing these lore decisions are going to make us examine, of course, is the Bane Lich's lair. I wanted to give a couple traits that sort of mirror the Lich's lair traits, and that starts with the all-knowing trait. In contrast to the Lich's all-seeing lair trait, which allows the Lich to cast clairvoyance for free, the all-knowing lair trait allows the Bane Lich to cast commune for free, meaning that while it's in its lair, a Bane Lich has their god on speed dial. And since a Bane Lich isn't really concerned with the consuming of souls for its continued existence, instead of the Lich's inevitable siphon trait, which consumes the souls of creatures who die in their lair, I gave the Bane Lich the inevitable service lair trait, which causes any creatures that die in the lair to rise from the dead as a wight or wraith under the Bane Lich's control, depending on whether or not their body was intact when they died. These two lair traits are pretty brutal, but my favorite thing about them is that not only is the Lich's lair affected by these traits, but the mile radius surrounding the present location of any Bane Lich reliquary is also affected by both of these traits, meaning that if the Bane Lich stores its reliquaries strategically around its lair, the area of influence can spread far and wide. Or if it wants to place a reliquary in various temples or strongholds dedicated to its god all over the world, these cursed reliquaries will provide a benefit to the devotees of the Lich's god anywhere they see fit. All in all, this does make a Bane Lich a bit more powerful than your standard Lich, which is reflected by their challenge rating of 22 over the Lich's 21, but I think that's kind of telling in a way. Despite all the incredible and terrifying things a Lich can do, they're not gods, and that same power, when granted by a deity, manifests in ways that are even more profound and deadly than what a mere mortal is capable of. Which brings us to our final segment and a look at how to best use the Bane Lich in a D&D campaign. Right after a word from these sponsors, don't touch that dial, it's me. I'm sponsors. Believe it or not, I couldn't find a sponsor for my 30-minute video about clerics that unironically includes a quote from the Bible, so I'm sponsoring myself. Nobody can stop me. See this shirt? You want one? Check it out on the Dungeon Dad merch store, linked below. Father's Day rapidly approaches, or maybe you just have dad vibes. In either case, check out the Dad Stats shirt for all your dad needs. It has a dad on it with 69 hit points, a thing that started as a joke, and then I actually sat down with a notepad to figure out how to mathematically stat out a creature with an average of 69 HP. Turns out the answer to that is to use D12s and give the creature a 20 in Constitution, which makes no sense because the stat block is supposed to be for a dad, and your dad is probably human, which means it should use D8s, right? Wrong! If you have this shirt on, your dad's a huge creature, which means he has D12s, and my shitty sex number joke is justified. What was I talking about? Oh yeah, buy a shirt, check out my adventure zine. It's got a hex crawl, a fey curse, a lich tower, puzzles, a sad tree, and a 3-stage boss fight where you have to outmaneuver an archfey who is trying to hunt you for your meat. Wow! Link is in the description to all of that. I now declare this ad complete. Please buy a shirt and help me maintain my financially crippling addiction to buying Morkborg RPGs. Speaking of which, let's get into why the Bane Lich is a fantastic candidate to be the big bad of your next D&D campaign. The Bane Lich achieves something that few monsters can, and that it perfectly blends elements of player expectation, the metagame, with character expectation and the in-game experience. Within its own lore, Bane Liches are extremely uncommon, which means that there is a lot less information out there about them, and that this is something they will absolutely use to their advantage. In fact, many Bane Liches, as they have appeared throughout the years, take steps to hide their true identity, and if their undead nature is ever discovered, they often try to play it off as if they are a traditional lich so that anyone who wants to destroy them will waste valuable time and effort looking for a phylactery. This mirrors the fact that in the real world, the idea of a lich within pop culture is pretty well solidified, especially among D&D players, so if your adventuring party hears about a powerful undead spellcaster, they're likely to assume they're dealing with a lich, both in and out of character, and that is an assumption that you as a game master can use. Let them investigate this lich. Maybe the Bane Lich even creates a decoy phylactery and hides it within a dungeon, knowing that if someone manages to destroy it, they'll attempt to face the lich, assuming that if they destroy it, they have won, only for the lich to reform in a few days and continue their scheming. The only difference now is that the world at large thinks they've been destroyed, which means that the lich's enemies might be led into a trap of overconfidence. Then you get to have a third act twist where the players eventually uncover the true nature of what they're dealing with and the final battle actually begins. The other thing to keep in mind is that a Bane Lich, by necessity, is devoted to the service of a god. So who that god is and what their goals are should more or less be the same goals as the Bane Lich. If you're playing in a world similar to Theros, where gods regularly interfere with the lives of mortals, this could be a dynamic and direct relationship where the Bane Lich isn't even the final boss, but rather the head of this god's forces, and ultimately the players will need to deal with the avatar of this deity to truly see them defeated. If you're playing in a world such as the Forgotten Realms, where the gods tend to be somewhat more distant, this is still an important thing to consider, because a Bane Lich, while not a deity, is more or less behaving as an avatar of that god on the material plane. The majority of the time, the god who created the Bane Lich is going to be an evil god who probably has domain over death, or something else adjacent, like war, but That's not always the case, and there is plenty of room for subversion of that assumption. Perhaps the god in question is actually a good aligned deity, maybe even a god with domain over the forces of life, and they see this Bane Lich as a necessary evil to protect their people on the material plane from some existential threat. Or perhaps there's something that lies on the bounds of neutrality, where you have a deity that has no interest in the struggle between good and evil, instead simply subscribing to their own agenda. A great example of this would be the goddess Evening Glory. She is a neutral goddess of death, undeath, beauty, and love of all things. Her entire goal is to help couples who are in love with one another remain together forever by turning them into undead. It's a lot less horrific than you'd think, because those she blesses with undeath don't rot and decay, but instead remain preserved forever exactly as they are. She doesn't force people to undergo this change either. It's entirely consensual, and while you can argue it might be misguided or a perversion of the natural order, is it evil? Maybe. But it forces you to ask some interesting questions, the answers to which aren't always black and white. I already made a video about her, which goes into way too much detail, and to date it's one of my favorite projects I've ever worked on, so if you saw that video or you go watch it after this, you might recall that her most powerful clerics are liches. They aren't specifically called out as Bane Liches, but that's what Libris Mortis, the book Evening Glory is from, describes. The leaders of her church are high-ranking clerics who she has blessed with lichdom, and instead of turning into rotting skeletal creatures, they are preserved, appearing entirely alive until you check for a pulse. A Bane Lich working for such a deity could make for a great campaign villain, and depending on the story you choose to tell with that villain, there's room for tons of nuance and tough moral quandaries, if your players are into that sort of thing. The Bane Lich can also be a great way to mix up the trope of an undead overlord, even if you don't try to hide its true nature or do anything outside the box with their patron deity. A straight up good versus evil conflict where the Bane Lich is a servant of an evil god who is unquestionably the bad guy leading a bunch of cultists to take over the world is a tale as old as time, but I think the reliquaries provide a nice little twist on a classic adventure formula. Instead of hunting down the Lich's phylactery, the adventuring party will have to travel the world over and destroy all 12 or however many of the Bane Lich's reliquaries there are to be destroyed, which are likely stored within temples or other well-guarded fortresses dominated by the servants of the Bane Lich's god. If you want to add a little spice, maybe each reliquary is actually one of those sacred weapons I mentioned before, powerful and highly cursed, and wielded by the 12 champions of the Bane Lich, and they must be defeated and their weapons destroyed before our heroes can truly destroy the Bane Lich overlord. There are tons of undead creatures that could serve as these champions, or even just powerful minions for the Bane Lich too. Obviously Death Knights with their ties to the Paladin class and very often in service to some dark power can make for a great ally to the Bane Lich. You've also got the Angels of Decay from D&D 3.5, which I converted in a video last fall, who would tie in really nicely with the clerical theme of the Bane Lich. I mean, they're literally undead angels. You can't get much more theme appropriate than that. And for minions, there are a litany of undead that work for any kind of Lich, especially in Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft, which houses some of my favorite undead monsters in 5e. I mean, just picture it. The final showdown with the Bane Lich and their congregation of cultists, except all of those cultists are actually just skeletons, and wrapped around each skeleton is a boneless, also known as what happens when you use necromancy to reanimate just the skin of a creature's corpse. The players are sure to react well to an army of undead skin crawling towards them while skeletons pelt them with arrows. All the while the Bane Lich looks on from the diocese of their temple and casts spells from on high. I mean, we've even got Ravenloft Horrors Within dropping next month, which is sure to have some updates for existing monsters and maybe a few new candidates for champion status as well. Personally, I'm hoping we see an update to the Relentless Killer, because that stat block in Van Richten's Guide is really fun, but also because a giant murder man wearing a steel helmet fashioned as a symbol of their god, wielding a Bane Lich reliquary scythe, sounds sick as hell. There's also something to be said for the idea of a Bane Lich operating in plain sight. Regardless of whether we're dealing with a high-ranking cleric of an evil deity, a good deity, or even a neutral one, the Bane Lich operating from a temple that is built within a large city and doing their villainous behavior in the shadows could be great. This is especially fun if you want to roll with more of a political intrigue angle. Most people probably don't realize that the head of this established temple in town is in fact an undead creature, so of course it falls on the party to investigate and expose what they are and what they're actually up to. Honestly, the party going into this just thinking they're investigating a cult who is doing sacrificial murders or something, only to find out as they dig deeper that the man in charge isn't just some mid-level cult leader, but a goddamn lich, is a great reveal, especially if they have had conversations with this guy before and he seems relatively unassuming. Like, yeah, sure, he's obviously up to something suspicious, but being a creature as powerful as a lich is not likely going to be the first thing people assume about the weird dude who runs a local church, even if that church is one dedicated to a less than savory deity. And none of this even gets into the inner turmoil and political climate that might be festering around the Bane Lich in its religion. What happens if a Bane Lich's ambition reaches beyond their station and they want to themselves become a god? Because that's the thing about being a cleric. They only have their power as long as their deity continues to afford it to them. If their god catches wind of the Bane Lich's ambitions, they might simply abandon the Lich and watch them turn into dust. However, a clever Bane Lich might be able to find a way to steal the power from their god if they've got the guts to even try. And that could become a real problem. Or conversely, maybe their god not only knows about the Lich's ambition to become a god, but is actively encouraging them to pursue it. If the Bane Lich is pledged to a powerful deity, that deity may offer ascension from mortal to Bane Lich, and then from Bane Lich to demigod or lesser god, all to build a new pantheon of death gods in service to this greater power. Perhaps the primary deity is even trapped in some way, so while they can't break loose on their own and wreak havoc, they are gradually building a pantheon of these lesser gods who can free this great evil from its imprisonment and plunge the world into darkness. What started as a weird oddity from 2nd edition has quickly spiraled out into one of my favorite new monsters, and I am so excited to build a campaign around this thing. May it serve you well, and may it prove that while faith is its own reward, in the case of some deities, it is also the means by which you can attain power beyond mortal comprehension through sacred undeath and service unending. Hey, thank you so much for watching my video about cleric liches. Cleriches? Whatever. I had so much fun making this monster. I hope you enjoyed learning all about it and find a use for it at some point in the future. If you want to support the channel and help me keep on doing what I'm doing, the Dungeon Dad merch store is linked down below, and of course I wouldn't be here every week without the support of my amazing patrons over on Patreon. It's $3 a month. You get access to some high-res PDFs along with some other behind-the-scenes extras, as well as polls that help me decide what content I want to make in the future. So if you want to check that out, also linked in the description down below. Which reminds me, I gotta give a massive shout out to this week's randomly selected Patron of the Week. Thank you to Christian Lally for all of your support, it means the most. And one more time, thank you for watching. If you've got a monster you'd like to see show up in a future episode of Monster of the Week, let me know in the description. You can't edit that. In the comments. Let me know in the comments down below, or in the Dungeon Dad Discord, which is also linked down below in the Creature Suggestions channel. It will get added to the list, and who knows, you might just see it show up in a future episode of Monster of the Week. I would also love to hear what you think about the whole Cleric situation with the Bane Lich. Tell me if you like its name, tell me if you like the way I designed it, what changes you would make, or just any general ideas you have for how you might want to use this thing in the future, because, like I said, I got a campaign to create for my home game, and I am going to steal some ideas from the comments section. But seriously, I love reading what you guys have to say about the monsters that I create, so let me know your thoughts. One last time, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Till then.